Welcome everybody. I could say we're going to talk about death and taxes, but we're talking about taxes this afternoon, but we should actually talk about death, taxes and regulatory change, which has actually been phenomenal in the last, 12 to 18 months. But also, I suppose the regulator has been very active in many spaces that we all work and breathe in. So the regulator has very much looked at managed investment schemes, whether they're unitised or non-unitised. They've looked at SMAs, they've looked at MDAs, they've looked at conflicts, they've looked at rebates, they've looked at discounts. Every aspect of most of a platform or advisor's business has been looked at. And so we're going to sort of run through some things that are topical and top of mind, but also, I suppose, any issues from the floor are welcome as well. So please join in. One thing I suppose that got focused on quite a lot in the last sort of 12 months was obviously the way in which platforms created menus of investment options and the way that they conducted their due diligence, ongoing management and oversight of those investment options. But equally, that's in a licensee's land as well. And so I've had many principals come to me and say, I have to create an APL, I have to create an investment option that both is good on a standalone basis, but is also can be combined in a portfolio. And I have to look at TMDs now, and I have to ensure that everything's going right. How can I possibly do that with scale? And what are the things that I have to consider at law? And so that's why we have Andrew here, to tell us the legal part, because we're all very good at the practical part, but sometimes we forget the legal part. And when we're looking at that, we're looking at things like Reg 779 and also the APRA test. So let's just jump into 779 and just the obligations on me as a platform and on a licensee in creating a basic thing, which we all take for granted, which is an APL.
Thanks, Francy. I think even for us lawyers, the legal landscape has been actually really difficult to unpack this last couple of years. We've seen the regulators basically look at platform trustees and say, well, why aren't you regulating the managed account industry? Why aren't you regulating advisors, managed investment industry rather, and advisors? And a lot of platforms are sort of reeling from that. We've traditionally had this view that we're a supermarket, we provide access to choice and people make their own choices. But what we've seen, if I continue that analogy in the supermarket world, when we had razor blades and strawberries, Coles and Woolworths were found liable. So that's what we've had with Shield and First Guardian. We've had razor blades and strawberries, and the industry's going through a fair bit of a shift and change as a result of that. In terms of APLs, I'd say the APL is the responsibility of the advice licensee to determine. But that said, what we've seen, and you talked about 779, so ASIC will say, if you go back every few years, they've touched on this point, but 779 was February 2024. ASIC talked about trustees needing to have more oversight of performance of investment options, and it was really a focus on performance and to really test whether things should be on menu or not, rather than just putting things on because advisors have asked for them to be on. So what we see now, particularly in the wake of Shield and First Guardian, a lot more scrutiny from trustees on investment options, a lot of trustees really grappling with this idea of, well, should I be kicking people out of investment options? Should I be soft closing them? Should I be actually exiting people? Noting that there's obviously adverse tax impacts. What about orphan members? There's just so many issues that are coming up as we sort of unpack this.
Yeah, there certainly is. And it is, it's hard to not only cover the breadth of what you need to offer, but as you say, it's the complete management of when things go wrong. And they will go wrong, as Rebecca has said, they will go wrong. And so we've got to work out what's the way to best manage that for the client and for the advisor. So, but in that that regulatory focus, which, was quite amazing, the depth of information that ASIC actually asked of an RE, of myself, it was then sort of, I suppose, looking at, well, how do you ensure that they're performing against the benchmark? What reporting do you do? Is it visible on the website? It was constantly, working through the transparency of what was being offered, but also the transparency of fees, And I think that also sort of comes to the fore when groups often say, well, now I've had to stand up a very expensive research team in my licensee, and I've been doing all that research for quite some time, and I've been doing portfolios, whether it's paper-based or portfolios in a sense of implemented. How can I charge a fee? And what's appropriate, and when do I have to be worried about a conflict that's present in my business, and how do I manage that? And so can we just delve into, I suppose, the world of conflicts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think well before sort of any regulatory focus from a platform perspective, that's one thing I think we have had quite a close eye on is probably more on the side of conflicted remuneration than conflicts more generally. So on the one hand, conflicted remuneration, are you incentivized by payments to the managed account provider to be recommending that product? That's an issue that we're all familiar with, and I think we've all tested. But I think conflicts, in a more general sense, is probably a little bit less mature.
Yeah.
And that's going to, I think, come through in this review. Just if I can sidebar on this review. So ASIC started this managed accounts review, I think, 2018. I've got a lot of grey hair since those days, but I remember talking with one of our clients who offered ASIC a bit of a 101 on how managed accounts work. And I said, would you like to come down to our offices and we'll sort of talk you through some of the basic structures? And someone at ASIC said, oh, that'd be great. This is pre-COVID. 50 people from ASIC showed up. It gives you a sense of a real hunger for knowledge. And to your point, Francy, in this round of reviews, we helped quite a number of parties with their responses. We really saw the cold hand of AI in this. ASIC usually would have a conversation with you about, no, we don't really want that information. Let's hone the response so that you give us what we really are looking for. Here it was, we want everything, and we want it in a particular format because we're going to plug this into Copilot. Yep. And Copilot is going to do the review for us. So it remains to be seen what will come out, but I do think conflicts will be a key theme in two respects. One, from a platform perspective, really testing whether you are looking after members' interests when you're putting things on platform, or whether you're just effectively acceding to the wishes of a licensee. And then secondly, within the process, really testing whether advisors are giving fair and frank recommendations and advice to clients, or whether they're just recommending related party products. And the data will show, I think, that a lot of advice licensees that have a managed accounts arm, they're putting a lot of their clients into those products. And I think questions are going to be raised about that, but there are good reasons for that. But I think it's going to be on the industry to sort of explain that once we come out of this first round of review.
Yes, I mean, certainly we became aware of the questions that were being asked of the advisors, particularly where perhaps the risk profiling were not only recommending it to the managed account, but then further to one particular risk profile. And why was it that particular risk profile was being used? So it very much looked at how are you using this? And further to that, how are you using your APL? And further to that, let's dig into the portfolio itself. Does it have inherent conflicts in the structure because you're using a fund or an asset that you have created in itself? So it really did the layers, and unfortunately they were like onion layers, and I cried all the way through it when you consider how many managed accounts a platform does host. And so it really became, a very layered process, but also very much looking at the commercial relationships. And, if I give a particular group because they've got certain size and they have negotiated in well, they will get a discount or they will get a rebate on a fund. They were down into that detail, and it's not just, it's a process. Here's a number and you get a discount. The laws around giving a discount are very draconian in terms of the super laws. So I might just sort of touch on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think when money is flowing back to customers, that's a good thing. Yeah. And I don't think we'll see a huge amount of criticism of that aspect of it. But what we probably will see is that we've got very similar managed accounts on different platforms with very different outcomes, very different net outcomes because of discounts and things like that. So, and you will also see, and commonly on platforms, options that look the same, but there's a discount for some members and not for others. And so testing those kinds of arrangements is challenging. Often we give discounts on the basis of projected revenue, projected FUM, and then things don't pan out the way that we thought they might, and then you suddenly end up with a group of clients that you can't really justify on the basis of scale that they're getting the discount that they're getting. So all of those sorts of things, I think, will get some focus, but I think ultimately discounting and rebating is money back in members' hands is probably not the number one thing on ASIC's mind.
Yes. Also, I mean, I think what was interesting, the question was raised to me from ASIC was, well, how does an advice group or a licensee choose their platform? And you get varying responses, whether, a tender process had been run, whether, an asset consultant had helped them choose, whether it was an, existing relationship. And again, they sort of said, well, they can't just rely on independent research. And I said, no, clearly they don't. But again, they honed into, well, we see that a lot of the features and functionality are ticked off, but what scrutiny are they giving to the RE and the trustee and the way in which they'll work with you as a practice? And so that was an interesting insight, even from a regulator, to sort of say, well, actually, I can see all these widgets and ticks and bashes on, technology, but how do I know you're working with them in the right way? And that kind of then evolved to, well, what kind of oversight are you doing? And I was like, well, personally, I don't. but then, it clearly became that they thought that every single person in the food chain needed to provide that protectionism to the retail client. And so they were sort of then making accountabilities each along the way, and then really honed in on the platform to be giving a lot more oversight than perhaps we'd done in the past. And I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's a bit of a back to the future moment. I feel, in 2009 we had the Trio scandal, and the regulators stood on high and said, trustees are gatekeepers, trustees are gatekeepers. Then that word went away, and now it's back again in full force. This idea that the trustees are the ones that are supposed to be regulating the industry, and I accept that to a certain extent. But I think what's really challenging for platforms is, I'm working with advice groups. I'm trying to be helpful to them whilst maintaining compliance with my duties, and I'm in an environment where the regulatory expectations are rising, and sort of like, how fast do I go when the tide is moving and everyone is uplifting their governance and their oversight? If I'm going to be really difficult to work with, then I'm not going to win business. And so getting that balance right between compliance and being easy to work with and being helpful to a practice is really challenging, and I think something that the whole industry is kind of grappling with now. And a question I get all the time is, well, what are other people doing right now? Like, we're looking at making these changes to our processes, but who else is going to do that in the next 3 months? And so there's a little bit of hesitancy to be the first mover and to be uncompetitive.
Jumping back to performance, because they are very myopically focused on performance. If it's not 779, which is an ongoing and is ever present, but there has been the murmurings in Treasury to extend the APRA test to EDPs and then to managed accounts. Clearly it's there for TDPs, but then we've got questionable benchmarks where things fail, which perhaps shouldn't fail. But any commentary on the EDP and the extension to managed accounts?
It's amazing. I mean, the performance test was really brought in for a default environment where clients are not choosing their investments, and where we're making sure that if you don't make a choice, you're getting a good outcome. And so in the My Super context, when you can compare like with like, it made a lot of sense. The talk about extending to EDP has been around since the test started. I think we've seen some consultation, we've seen some draft legislation to extend the test to EDPs, but actually there's a carve-out in there which we use for pretty much all managed account providers, which they've not proposed to remove. So I don't know that they'll be successful if they just roll out legislation as drafted. It'll pick up your external funds, but I think that the really key thing to note in terms of people saying we need this now is that this sort of a test, it applies to funds that have been around for 10 years. It's not going to address the risks of a Shield or a First Guardian or a fund that hasn't got 10 years of performance history. And so I would say that extending the test to EDPs has limited value in that context. And again, when you think about a portfolio, unless it's described and defined as a diversified option that's intended to be a whole of portfolio solution, then I don't really know if there's a lot of benefit in looking to extend the test that far.
Right. And I mean, we'd certainly echo that, because it becomes, again, we go back to that basic APL and the platform menu to create that instability in something that is so fundamental is just, playing with fire. I mean, it really would mean we're closing one. And the reality of it is that we could close, a platform could keep open an option in one platform, close on another platform, and you've got portfolio managers wanting to keep consistency across platforms to provide that investment option across, and it would become chaos, because they'd be rebalancing here and changing investment options on that platform. It would then become quite different and disparate in what they're offering if that became the place. So, and that equally for MDAs. World of MDAs, the regs are being rolled, so to speak. Any insights there? I do. I have arrived.
Someone's arrived. Seeing a lot of interest in MDAs at the moment. I think we've realised that quite a lot of the industry has access to an MDA licence in one way or another. They are being seen as a potential solution to this performance test issue, which again brings me back to create an extra rule and we'll find an extra loophole. That's what us lawyers are for. But look, an MDA is a very useful solution that just puts a lot more of the compliance burden back on the licensee. Right, as compared to the platform. So I can imagine platforms saying MDAs are great and we can facilitate them, because then you've got a lot more of the obligation than we have. But look, it remains to be seen. I think the simplicity of the SMA model is that the governance and the oversight can be housed within the platform, and the platform's got the scale and the resources to do that in a really good way. So I'm still a big fan of the SMA model, but as I say, I'm definitely seeing a trend towards MDA as being a solution people are exploring more.
Yeah, okay. It is sort of right on where we'd probably ask for questions, so I'm going to open it up to the floor.
I just want to, just for clarification, you used the phrase EDP.
Oh, sorry.
Times. Now, I wonder if you'd just to make clear what EDP means and what it covers.
Thanks, Toby. So the performance test, the principle behind it was that trustees should only be accountable for measuring performance where they are actually doing the performance management. And so EDP stands for externally directed product. And the concept was if a Colonial First State invests in a Vanguard fund, for the sake of argument, well, Vanguard's doing the investment management, not Colonial First State, and therefore Colonial First State shouldn't be responsible for managing the performance and being accountable for performance of that option. So that's the principle. But then there's a lot of complexity behind that in superannuation because of the concept of connected entities. And so you have people who use an external trustee and then they use an external RE and so forth, and it gets a little bit complicated. If you then outsource the investment management back to the trustee or to a related party, you can get caught back into the test. But the principle is, if I'm not involved in the investment management as a trustee, then it's an EDP and it's outside the scope of the test at the moment.
So questions for Andrew or Francy?
Do we want to sort of cover wholesale, because that did obviously
wholesale.
come up in Michael's,
The other thing which I thought it might be interesting, a lot of this conversation has been about super, which is obviously fundamental to the people in this room and their clients. I thought it might be interesting to just touch on the super versus IDPS and whether there might be a divergence in the requirements and the way they're offered by the platforms.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, Toby. I think this is an area that's yet to play out. My personal view on that is that people tend to underestimate the level of duty that we have in an IDPS. The IDPS class order, the only thing it talks about in terms of duties, it says you must act honestly. And I think there's actually a typo in that clause for the sake of as well. So it's very unclear, but I think a lot of your general law best interest duties will apply to an IDPS. That is not tested at law, remains to be seen. What you have as an overlay in super is the CIS governance obligations around investment management and oversight and due diligence. Again, I think that all of those things could fall into an efficiently, honestly, fairly bucket or into a best interest bucket. I think the reality is if we saw a Shield or a First Guardian in an IDPS, I don't think the government would say, well, you acted honestly, so therefore there's nothing to see here. They'd go straight back to efficiently, honestly, fairly. You should have been doing more. So platforms as a whole are thinking about the two together and saying, well, what more should I be doing on IDPS? Is there a difference? There's probably a difference in a political context. There's probably a little bit of a difference in a legal context, but it's not as stark a difference as perhaps we thought.
I think also what was really clear from the ASIC interviews was that really they were looking to see documented frameworks, repeatable frameworks, and that it was consistently applied in every stage of your decision making, whether it was for an option on a menu, whether it was for the actual use of the platform itself. And so they really were looking through each of those documents to sort of say that there was that consistency. So I think that really is a focus for all businesses.
Yeah, just to clarify my last comment, I'll just say that the focus from a performance perspective has really been on super. So like ASIC report 779 that we talked about was about super specifically. My sort of view of it is I don't think you'll get the same level of degree of heat and focus on performance in the IDPS context, but I do think you'll get the same level of degree of heat in terms of overall investment governance and in terms of putting things on menu and risk and return in that sense.
Yes, over here. From a licensee's perspective, I can see why the regulator might be poking platforms in relation to checking what's on the shelf and making sure the suitability and performance is where it should be. The other role platforms seem to be doing is poking a lot of people in this room about the quality of their advice and the way they conduct their business. That's really a distinct conflict between what the role of a licensee and a platform. Just wondering if you would comment on that.
I'll comment on the certainly the what's on the menu and on the shelf. I mean, I'd have to demonstrate it, but so does the licensee have to demonstrate, and that's why that discussion on the APL, they virtually mirror the regulations on me are the regulations on you in what we offer in terms of investment option. And both of us have to demonstrate why it's on the shelf. No two ways about it. And then I suppose you unfortunately have to go one step further than that, say, why did you use it off the shelf? I can't really comment too much on the second part because that's part I'm not involved in, but it's certainly, I do hear that line, and it is an uncomfortable line from a platform as well to look into an advice process.
Yeah, uncomfortable is the right word, Francy. I think, we're being, as platforms are being told by the regulator that they need to be doing this. My personal view, from a legal perspective, that is not the role of a platform, but the regulator is being very, very clear that that is what it sees the role of a platform to be, is to be partly to be overseeing the quality of advice, to be reviewing SOAs, to be doing sampling, and to be satisfied that personal advice is being given. The latest sort of thing we've seen this year is the regulator saying, well, how are you platforms complying with your design and distribution obligations? And they say, well, there's a huge exception here when I'm dealing with advisors that are giving personal advice. And they say, well, how do you know they've given personal advice? Have you checked? Have you looked at the advice? And, bizarrely, if you look at the explanatory memorandum to the DDO legislation, the government used an example to say, well, the trustee doesn't have to check every piece of advice, but of course you should be looking at, a sampling of them. So the explanatory memorandum, which sort of gives an indication of what Parliament wants us to do, says we should be checking SOAs. So there is a degree of regulatory overreach. I don't think the platforms are happy about it. I'm sure they're not. But that's where we are, unfortunately.
Can I just pick up on, sort of extend that issue you've just spoken about, which is the regulator's view of its job? I know this doesn't speak to any particular piece of law or regulation, but just how ASIC in particular perhaps has changed its view of how it works and what it's responsible for. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so we've got a new chair of ASIC this year, Sarah Court, formerly deputy chair. Sarah is a very formidable regulator and enforcer, if you like. She was at the ACCC before that. If you hear Sarah speak, she'll say that she is a strong believer in deterrence through enforcement, and we've seen ASIC going out very loudly about record penalties, record number of actions, and so forth. We keep track on the statistics from our firm perspective as to how many investigations we're seeing ASIC launch every year. ASIC's roughly tripled the amount of investigations it launches year on year over the last 2 years. And, the regulatory penalties last year, they came out, 300 and something odd $1 million in penalties. And when you make that headline statement, the only thing you're doing is setting yourself a target for the following year. So we're going to see more enforcement in all sectors, not just platforms. The banks are feeling the same way. Last year when ASIC got a record penalty against ANZ Bank, I watched them in the Senate Economics Committee, and the Senate said, well, that's like 1% of ANZ's profit. Like, what are you doing with 280 million or something? And so they got criticised for not getting enough. So that's the environment that we're in right now. And certainly for the next few years,
Probably
the pendulum has swung that way.
Probably a Green senator said that.
Quite well be.
You might think.
Possibly.
Other questions? Last question for Francy and Andrew. Yes, here we go.
Just comment on the wholesale.
Just into the...
Can you just comment on the wholesale? I know a lot of what you're touching is retail advice.
Sure.
If you just comment on wholesale advice.
Look, I would say that that there is definitely advice groups that have predominantly dealt with retail clients, and then they have now an adjunct wholesale book of business, and that is causing, I suppose, not consternation, but ways in which that I have to have a framework for my retail, and now I have to have a framework for my wholesale, and I have to look at suitable products. Now, at the moment, that they're sort of saying, eyes wide open, buyer beware, your wholesale. But reality is that's still sitting on my platform, and I have to be comfortable that what I'm offering is in terms of an investment option to those wholesale clients is on par or better than, or on, going to do what I expect it to do in what I've designed. So I think I would say that it doesn't matter whether I'm offering wholesale or retail on the platform. I want to be comfortable that both will do what they're going to do. That then also goes to, is there the processes around identifying these wholesale clients in terms of the system, and also probably also looking at ways that, if you're doing a wholesale SMA, how do you allow for a client to actually fund that wholesale SMA? It won't necessarily come in all in one go. So there's sort of lots of different things that we have to look at in terms of a wholesale offering. But I don't know in terms of regulatory if there's been as focus on it. Yeah.
I think it'll take the regulator a little while to catch up to see the trend towards wholesale. But I'll say two things. One, the threshold tests to be a wholesale client haven't changed since FSR came in early 2000s. So that means that more and more people are becoming wholesale. And two, self-managed super is the biggest source of sort of wholesale funds, and there's a real grey area there. So our view of there's a specific limb for self-managed super to say if you have to have $10 million in an SMSF to capture this additional limb. Now our view from a legal perspective is that's just an additional limb, and if you meet any of the wholesale tests, including that one, you're wholesale. AFCA has come out and said, no, an SMSF is a retail unless it has 10 million. ASIC had previously said AFCA is wrong. ASIC has since removed that statement from its website and is now completely agnostic on the issue. But AFCA is banging the drum very, very hard. It's lobbying government to change the law while saying that they already think that is the law. So I think we'll see some movement in wholesale, particularly around SMSF, because just too many people would be considered wholesale if you look at the size of their super assets alone.